Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. I am your host, Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Elite Church of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 334 and we're covering Gaudium et Spes 53. The topic is, what is culture? If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we concluded Chapter 1 of Part 2, Some Problems of Special Urgency, and the topic was marriage and family are the foundation of society, so Christians need to live and support them. Today, we're starting Chapter 2, still in Part 2, and Chapter 2 is titled The Proper Development of Culture. So we're going to be talking about culture for the next week or so. The summary of today is defining culture and understanding how each differs as we all live in a culture. And this paragraph 53 is the only paragraph before they have sections in this chapter. This paragraph has 3 subparagraphs. We're going to read in 2 parts. A and B talk about how human life always involves culture and tries to define culture. And C talks about how each culture has different history and a different way of approaching things and how we should respect that. So let's begin right away with A and B. 53A. Man comes to a true and full humanity only through culture. That is through the cultivation of the goods and values of nature. Wherever human life is involved, therefore, nature and culture are quite intimately connected one with the other. B. The word culture, in its general sense, indicates everything whereby man develops and perfects his many bodily and spiritual qualities. He strives by knowledge and his labor to bring the world itself under his control. He renders social life more human both in the family and the civic community through improvement of customs and institutions. Throughout the course of time, he expresses, communicates, and conserves in his works great spiritual experience and desires, that they might be of advantage to the progress of many, even of the whole human family. This paragraph in this chapter starts by noting that we all live in some culture. Some things can seem self-evident to us, which are completely foreign and not self-evident to others in other cultures. For example, I've taught English to native Spanish speakers several times. And we have sounds in English that they just don't have in Spanish. For example, to a native English speaker, even my nephew who isn't even in preschool yet, ship, sheep, chip, cheap are 4 very clearly distinct words that there is no confusion about. But because the sounds there are different, are not distinguished in Spanish, to someone who natively speaks Spanish and is first learning English, they will often sound the same. That's a challenge. That's something that we think is self-evident, those are different, but it's not to others. Another aspect I've dealt with talking to people from other parts of the world is our Western emphasis on individualism and the individual as the focus. And we can compare that to an East Asian Confucian view or a kind of very collectivist view where societal hierarchy and collective is so important, where your bonds, your family are really more important than abstract moral laws, more important than the 10 Commandments is the most important commandment is 4, honor your father and your mother. And it can go too far where this social structure doesn't allow the individual to do what they should be able to do. And culture interacts with our nature. Then, in 53b, the Council defines culture. It says it's everything whereby man develops and perfects his many bodily and spiritual qualities. This is a broad definition. Most often we think of culture, we think of things like stories, media, ways of expressing ourselves. But this broad definition includes a lot of internal attitudes, ways of going about things that we may not even be conscious about. Each culture allows a specific expression. We live in a culture. Every human being lives in a culture. It's impossible for a human being not to live in a culture. And there are also different levels of culture. There is a culture of my own community versus the church. And my own community is not in opposition to the church, but there's certain things that are just assumed in my community that I would not assume if I'm in a parish. And things like that. And the culture brings the world to our level and brings us to the world. Finally, for these two subparagraphs, we note that culture has spiritual values. We want to bring out the good values here, the good spiritual values, and we want to express the different truths that are there in the spiritual life in different cultures. I am going to express myself differently speaking to a bunch of people of Western Europe than I am to a bunch of people from Asia and the Philippines, Asia, Vietnam, the Philippines, etc. There's huge Catholic populations that originate from each of those areas of the world, but they're different. Their cultures are different, and we need to respect those. Moving on to our second half today, 53C. The theme is each culture has different history and way of approaching things. Let's begin. C. Thence it follows that human culture has necessarily a historical and social aspect. And the word culture often also assumes a sociological and ethnological sense. According to this sense, we speak of a plurality of cultures. Different styles of life and multiple scales of values arise from the diverse manner of using things, of slavery, of expressing oneself, of practicing religion, of forming customs, of establishing laws and juridical institutions, of cultivating the sciences, the arts, and beauty. Thus, the customs handed down to it form the patrimony property of each human community. It is also in this way that there is formed the definite historical milieu, which unfolds the man of every nation and age, and from which he draws the values which permit him to promote civilization. We have to recognize that every culture comes from a certain historical milieu, and a certain history that may not be present at the day. And there are differences based on this. Let's take, for example, Thanksgiving. I'm recording this before Thanksgiving, but it will go out after Thanksgiving. Why do we have Thanksgiving in November? Well, if we look back to the time it was instituted, the U.S. was largely an agricultural society. And the most appropriate time to celebrate and thank God for all the blessings of the year is at the end of the harvest season. And this is probably just after harvest is done and everything's pulled in for the year. At the same time, we eat turkeys. Why? Well, turkeys are one of the native animals of North America that are very delicious to eat. Turkeys and deer. We could have had the tradition become venison or something for Thanksgiving too, but it ended up being turkey. And that is something very unique to American culture. I go to Europe and there is no Thanksgiving Day. They may have some other kind of day of thanking for all the blessings or something, a totally different time of year for a totally different reason or things. And here we note that there are a plurality of cultures. There are many different cultures. There's different levels, like I noted, between the U.S., a particular parish, particular religious community, things like that. And there's also a gradient. For example, people will talk about Midwestern or Southern culture, but there are states which are borderline and kind of a mix and things like that. It's not just a hard line. Once you cross the Ohio River, you go from the Midwest to the South once you're in Kentucky. No, you notice if you've been there, there's kind of a gradient. And then every culture has modes of expression and ways to do things. We have certain things that are just kind of presupposed. For example, the kind of culture that the suburban development promotes is different than is in many other countries. And we should order these differences to good. There's also the recognition of the differences, even in superficial things. I remember having grown up in Canada, one of the biggest things in the U.S. that was kind of a bit getting used to when I was first working out in the field, outside the seminary, was I would be invited over to families' houses to have a meal or something like that. And as soon as I stepped inside, I would immediately take off my shoes. This would be the cultural norm in Canada. If I walked in my parents' house and I did not take off my shoes, my mom would remind me of this or something, or kind of give me a kind of sideways look to remind me or something. I would never intentionally walk around my parents' house in my shoes that I wore outside. It's just the cultural thing in Canada. Whereas in the US, it's much less culturally common to take off your shoes inside the house. And it's important to note the different values these cultures have and to try and promote it. One of the priests I live with, Father Patrick Langan, has been looking at how different cultures have kind of a national story, a national set of values, and how we as the church can look and try and evangelize those values. That is the kind of thing we're looking at here. That is what we are seeking to do here as a church. So, thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarCrest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the StarCrest Patreon. Tomorrow, I'm going to continue with the next paragraphs of Gaudium Spes, which is paragraphs 54 to 56 on growing cultural consciousness. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which will provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X. There's also an SQPN Discord server at sqpn.com/Discord, and on there you'll find a channel for Vatican II in a Year. Amen.